Strap on your tanks and dive right in. Underwater Videographer is live right now.
From this moment on, you will now be known as Sharkbait.
Equalize your ears and grab your dive bag to start collecting some tips, tricks, product announcements, and information for every hobby and professional diver interested in knowing what it takes to capture the clearest footage.
Sharkbait! Welcome, brother Sharkbait!
Get ready to explore the depths with the Underwater Videographer Podcast.
Sharkbait! Enough of the Sharkbait. Sharkbait! Ooh.
I'm Marshall Karp, and with me today is Tim Zimmerman. Tim is a freelance writer and correspondent for Outside Magazine. He has also written for Sports Illustrated, Men's Journal, Sailing World, and Sail Magazine, among others. Before he chucked his day job for a life of unlimited freedom and irregular paychecks, he was a senior editor and diplomatic correspondent for U.S. News and World Report. He is the author of The Race, an account of the world of extreme sailing. Tim lives with his wife and daughter in the Washington, D.C. area. How you doing today, Tim?
Doing very well.
This is a very unusual story that we want to bring to our listeners here at the Underwater Videographer Podcast. And we'll get into the Dave Shaw story is what it is. I think there's a lot of interest out there for it. So, and you wrote the article chronicling Dave Shaw's dive attempts for Outside Magazine. So before we get into the story, let's find out a little bit about you. Why don't you give us a little more of your background?
Well, I started out as I'm the son of a Foreign Service officer. I went to graduate school in London in a department called War Studies, and when I came back to the States, I started working at U.S. News and World Report in their World Affairs section. And I love journalism because I'm a dilettante at heart. I love to get into different subjects. And the great thing about journalism is as long as you can write, you're free to pursue whatever interests you have. So I started out writing about foreign affairs and American diplomacy. And after a number of years, I burned out on that a little bit and sailed a boat down to the Caribbean. And on the way down there, I ran into the tail end of Hurricane Mitch and called up Cruising World when I arrived in the Caribbean and said, would they like a story about going through a storm like that? And they said yes, and I realized that maybe I could then turn to writing about the outdoors and sailing, which I love to do. So that brought me to Outside eventually, and I started writing for them about sailing mostly to start with, and eventually branching out into other topics, and ended up starting a blog called the Wet Ass Chronicles, which was a blog about adventure and record setting and somewhat satirical, with lots of pictures and funny captions and news. And that's how I came across the Dave Shaw story to start with. But it obviously is an incredible story. And whenever the Outside editors would call me up and say, what kind of ideas did I have, I would always turn to a list of ideas that I would have accumulated as a result of looking for material for my blog. And that was one of the top stories that I had come across. And as soon as I described to them the story, they said, all right, get on a plane and go to South Africa.
Very good, very good. Quite a background. Let's give our listeners here who are mainly divers. So you have some diving background too.
It's a little bit funny. I did a fair amount of just reef diving when I was younger in my teens down in the Caribbean. And that was at a time when there was no real regulation or, no one really paid much attention to being certified. I was instructed by a guy who had a dive shop at a resort down there, and he used to take us all diving, me and my family and father, and other people diving on the wrecks and coral reefs down there. But I had no formal training. And then I went and I did the Dave Shaw story, and I did another story about a guy who dives with big squid down in the Gulf of Mexico. And I thought, well, you know what? If I'm going to do all this diving, maybe I should get certified. So I had some dive experience, but I actually did the training after the fact as I ended up, as part of my job with Outside, starting to do some diving, which probably would have been better if I'd had some real training before I did it.
Okay. How many dives do you have in now?
Oh, well, I got a bunch of dives in last year. I don't know. I mean, I'm still probably no more than a dozen, 20 dives in recent years. Probably total in my life, maybe I've done 50 dives. So I'm an enthusiastic diver, but I'm by no means a super experienced diver.
There you go. Okay, now the article came out. Now you did a Nightline feature. Why don't you tell us about that experience?
Well, that was a partnership that came, typically out of an unexpected just encounter with a Nightline producer at a friend's house here in Washington. He asked me what sorts of stuff I was working on, and I just started planning the Dave Shaw trip. And I explained to him about the Dave Shaw story, and he said, wow, he thought that Nightline might be very interested in doing a piece as well, and would we like to partner? And Outside was enthusiastic about that, so they hooked me up with a cameraman and producer. Actually, it was one person, but he did both jobs, who was based out of South Africa. And he turned out to be really great to work with because since he was from South Africa, he knew his way around quite well. And he also happened to have some dive gear. So when we eventually went to Bushman's Hole, I borrowed his dive gear to do a little diving in Bushman's Hole so I could get at least some sense of what it might be like for those guys to go deep into a cave like that.
Did you get to talk to Ted Koppel or anything?
I never talked to Ted Koppel, believe it or not. It's the way they put it together was that this cameraman and I went all over South Africa. He taped all the interviews I did, and then I worked with a producer in the Nightline studios here in Washington, and eventually they brought Ted Koppel in to tape an introduction to the piece and to do some interviews, I guess, but I never spoke with him directly.
Wondered how that worked.
Yeah, no, actually the whole experience was a real sort of insight into behind the scenes of how television gets made, and it definitely has some good parts, and it definitely has a lot of bad parts.
Perhaps another time we'll get into the good and the bad there.
I
think everyone wants to focus more on the story here. But the South African filmmaker that you hooked up with, now who was that?
Well, part of the reason that this story turned into the story it did, I think, is that one, it's an incredible story just to start with. Just the facts of the story are incredible. But when I started looking into it to write it up, I discovered that Dave Shaw, who loved to dive in South Africa and had developed this great friendship with one of South Africa's premier deep cave divers, Don Shirley, had hooked up with a videographer in South Africa, a producer named Gordon Hiles, who had a lot of experience filming in the outdoors as well as doing underwater filming. And so I discovered that there was a lot of tape of Dave Shaw, both around the dive he did originally where he discovered the body of Dion Dreyer, but also subsequent to that and leading up to the recovery dive where he then went back in January of 2005 with Don Shirley and a whole team to try to recover the body. And that tape included, which was a critical part of the story in the end for me, included a helmet camera that Gordon Hiles had ingeniously put together that could survive and operate at depths of up to 270 meters. And so not only was the story or the facts of the story just incredible, but there was a lot of interviews with Dave Shaw, so in a way I could watch those interviews. Gordon Hiles kindly let me look at them. So I had a sense of what Dave Shaw was like as a person, but in addition there was very dramatic footage of what actually happened to him on the bottom of Bushman's Hole that led to his death. So I really had the complete story, thanks to Gordon Hiles in part.
I think for our listeners here, we've gone into the backstory on the writing and the television show Nightline. So let's get into the Dave Shaw story here. Tell us about that, Tim.
Well, Dave Shaw was a very interesting guy. He was Australian, and he was an airline pilot based out of Hong Kong. And late in his life, he was, I guess, in his 40s, he discovered diving. And he and his son started diving together out in Asia. And he quickly developed a taste for it and for the adventure of it. And he wasn't happy. He was the kind of guy who wasn't happy just to continue to do reef diving and normal diving. And he quickly started to go deeper and very quickly got into cave diving and the use of rebreathers, which made sense since he wanted to spend a lot of time underwater. He then met up with Don Shirley down in South Africa, he'd heard about Bushman's Hole, and he'd heard about Don Shirley, who has a training center with a very deep quarry that he trains people to do rebreather diving on. And Dave Shaw showed up one day and said, "Hey, can I go dive in your quarry?" And Don Shirley's very capable instructor, great diver. And he looked at Dave Shaw and he thought, here's this interesting guy. He just wants to go off and dive by himself. He thought, okay, I'll let him do it. And Dave Shaw went off and went diving in the quarry, came back, and they became friends and ended up doing a lot of exploratory diving together. There are many, many great places to dive in South Africa, obviously, and one of the best is Bushman's Hole, which is one of the largest underwater caves in the world. And so Dave Shaw, as he got more experience on rebreathers, decided he wanted to try to dive to the bottom of Bushman's Hole, which is a little over 270 meters deep.
And for the non-metric out there, that's about 850 feet.
Yeah, it's plenty deep, no matter which metric, which figure you're using.
Oh, I've been to 100 twice with no decompression, just down and up, and I can't imagine going down to 850 feet though. But they wanted to see the bottom.
Well, and the interesting thing about Dave Shaw is that, and this says a little bit about what kind of guy he was, is he wasn't just out to go to the bottom and come back up, which alone would have been the deepest I think a rebreather had been taken. But he wanted to actually go explore. That's what his fundamental nature, the reason he got excited to do this was exploration, not just bouncing off the bottom and setting some record. So when he and Don Shirley were diving Bushman's Hole in the fall of 2004, he got to the bottom, and then he got around doing what he came there for, which was to swim around a little bit. And he tied a cave reel to the shot line dropping down to the bottom, and he started to swim off. And very quickly he saw the body of a diver lying on the bottom of the cave. And he knew that it was a guy named Dion Dreyer. Dion was a 20-year-old who had gone diving in the cave with some friends. He wasn't that experienced a number of years earlier, and he had simply disappeared. His parents had gone to efforts to try to find him on the bottom and to recover him, but eventually they gave up, and they just put up a plaque saying who he was and memorializing him. So most of the divers who ever went to Bushman's Hole knew about Dion Dreyer, and here Dave Shaw was on the bottom, and he came across his body.
There he was.
He made an effort to lift him up, but he couldn't quite get him out of the mud or the silt.
Now, your article had it that he was laying on his back.
He was laying on his back with his tanks and his harness, sunk into the silt and the mud a little bit. And he had no skin anymore on the exposed parts of his body, so his head was raw bone, and his hands. But there was a mass inside his wetsuit, which had been protected from the elements a little bit. But Dave Shaw made a quick effort to try to recover him. But as all your diving listeners know, it's a very bad thing to exert yourself too much that deep underwater and to start breathing too fast. And so as soon as he realized he couldn't easily recover him or pull him off the bottom, he just tied his cave line or cave reel to him and went back to the shot line and started his ascent.
He did the smart thing there.
He did the smart thing. He's a very, very calm and rational thinker, and very deliberate in everything he does.
Now, it was not only the exertion and carbon dioxide buildup. He also had to be concerned with the nitrogen.
That's right.
Specifically, nitrogen narcosis.
That's right. He was very, for all those reasons, he was very aware of, what sort of condition his body was, how he was reacting to the depth, and he knew he didn't have very much bottom time anyways. So instead of trying to just make an unplanned body recovery, he returned to the shot line, he started his ascent, he met up with Don Shirley, he wrote on a slate that he had hit 270 meters, a record, and then he wrote, "Found Dion." And Don Shirley knew immediately what he was talking about, and as they continued their ascent up to the surface, Dave Shaw obviously was decompressing for hours and hours. Don Shirley realized that Dave Shaw, being the kind of guy he was going to come out and say that he wanted to try to go recover the body. And that's exactly what Dave Shaw did. And he called up Dion Dreyer's parents, who never expected to see their son again, and said, "I'm Dave Shaw. I found the body of your boy, and I'd like to go back and recover him for you. And they said, thank you, thank you, thank you. So Dave and Don took a few months. They called in a bunch of good cave divers, all rebreather qualified, and they put together a fairly elaborate plan to return to Bushman's Hole and to recover Dion Dreyer. And they came back in January, and they launched into this plan, which had Dave all the way at the bottom and putting Dion into a body recovery bag and then passing him up a chain of divers to the surface. And Don Shirley was the first diver who was above him at a depth of, I think, roughly 500 feet. And as soon as Don Shirley got down to his station, Dave Shaw went in first, and as soon as Don Shirley got down to his station, he could see that Dave Shaw's light wasn't moving. So he realized something terrible was going wrong. And even though Dave Shaw had told everyone not to try to come recover him because he didn't want anyone else to die if he got into trouble, Don Shirley started to descend to see if he could help Dave. And then he started to have equipment problems. His controller, his rebreather controller, packed it in, and he had to shift to a manual mode of rebreathing and couldn't continue to go down. And so he himself started to go up. He ran into further trouble. He started to suffer vertigo. He got a bend in his inner ear, a helium bubble in his inner ear, started to throw up underwater. And so the entire focus of the dive then shifted very quickly to trying to save Don Shirley's life. And so the team quickly went into action and, really pulled off her heroic effort to get Don back to the surface. And just the iron will it took Don Shirley to stay underwater for up to 10 hours and make it out alive is also an incredible feat. The whole dive went wrong, unfortunately, and then Dave Shaw and Dion were on the bottom of Bushman's Hole together.
Right. It was 20 minutes after they got Shirley out of the water. He was in a decompression chamber then.
Yes. I mean, it's a testament to the planning of both Dave and Don that they really were prepared to any eventuality, and they had, because there was a dead body involved, they had called up the South African police and said that they were planning this dive, and the police brought in a dive team that would work the shallow depths, and they also brought in a portable decompression chamber. So I was very lucky to have it there. What is hard to convey is that Bushman's Hole really is just a small surface of water that at the bottom of a crater, really. And to get Don from the edge of the water up to the decompression chamber required him to be roped up on a sling. So really the work and the teamwork that got Don Shirley to the decompression chamber and saved his life was really an awesome thing.
The last you heard, how's he doing?
He's doing fine. I mean, he had some balance problems for quite a while, and the bend really affected his speech and his ability to walk a little bit. But he was determined to recover, and he was determined to dive again, even though I think that's slightly risky for him. But as far as I know, he hasn't had any trouble diving and going increasing depths. He's got a very, very devoted wife named Andre, who I'm sure keeps a close eye on things and draws the line if she thinks he's going into any danger.
So we have Shirley out of the water. The recovery attempt has gone very wrong. The last Shirley knows, Dave's light wasn't moving. As a matter of fact, I think he even saw it go out. So there we are, and then the rest of the story, like they say. Well,
so I mean, it was devastating. I mean, all the divers there had gotten to know Dave Shaw. They had great respect and affection for him. And Don basically came up and said, and on his way up, he passed off slates saying, "Dave's gone." And there was really no thought as to how he could be recovered. So the thinking originally was that Dave Shaw now would be entombed at the bottom of Bushman's Hole with Dion Dreyer. And just as a side note, I mean, Dion's parents had been waiting at the entrance to Bushman's Hole for their son to be recovered. And when they realized that Dave Shaw had died trying to recover their son, obviously it was a tremendously devastating blow. And there's an enormous amount of guilt that they feel about Dave Shaw going back to do that and dying, even though they know Dave Shaw did it of his own choice and because he wanted to take on that challenge. But anyhow, one of Don Shirley's close friends, a guy named Peter Herbst, a great diver himself, and he's the guy who took me into Bushman's Hole down to about 20 meters, stayed behind to recover the shot lines and a lot of the the bottles that were hanging off the line, and pull up equipment. The police divers were with him, and so he started to pull up equipment. And at some point, while he was underwater, Dave Shaw and Dion Dreyer floated past him and were pinned against the ceiling of the cave. Peter Herbst didn't see them, but when he came out, the police diver said, we saw them, they're there." And he went back in, and it turned out that Dave Shaw had gotten tangled in the cave line as he was trying to leave Dion Dreyer. And so Dion, Dave were attached in some ways to the shot line. So as soon as Peter Herbst had started to try to pull them up off the bottom or the shot line, they came with it, and then they got more buoyant as they got into shallower water, and they rocketed to the surface. So it turned out that Dave Shaw did end up recovering Dion Dreyer in a way, even though he's lost his life. And they pulled both Dave out and Dion was returned to his family. And Dave Shaw was wearing the helmet cam, and Gordon Hiles was on scene filming this whole thing, and no one really knew what had gone wrong, but what they did was they immediately took the helmet camera off Dave Shaw, and then they went to watch a film that showed basically the half hour of his life and revealed what had happened to him.
And Nightline showed some of this film?
Nightline showed some of the camera film as well, some of the head camera film. And I have to say that, I mean, one of the most moving parts of doing this story was actually watching a video of a man dying. I mean, it's really an incredible thing to sit there, and I did it a number of times with Don Shirley, with Gordon Hiles, and on my own computer, just to understand what had happened. And it's very powerful, and you hesitate to look at it. I mean, initially, but if you want to know what happened, then you have to look at it. But it really is a remarkable thing to just watch something like that on film.
Now, what were the gentlemen that you were watching with? How were they analyzing it? What did they have to say?
Well, I mean, I watched with Gordon Hiles and Don Shirley. Obviously, worked very closely together to understand what happened to Dave, and they did a very interesting thing actually. They after Don Shirley was recovered enough, they watched the tape together, and they had Don Shirley match Dave Shaw's breathing patterns, and to see if they could understand why he had blacked out and why he had died. And they watched the tape together, and as Dave Shaw's breathing increased, Don Shirley increased his breathing, and eventually he passed out because he was hyperventilating. So basically what happened with Dave Shaw is that he lost control of his breathing. And the reason he did, and this is something that we all understand can happen, and Dave Shaw understood could happen, is that the plan did not unfold as they had hoped. He swam, everything was fine on his descent. He got all the way to the bottom faster than he'd expected. He swam immediately to Dion Dreyer's body along the cave reel that he had left, and he started to unzip the body bag that his wife had made for this project. And when he tried to start putting Dion into it, instead of being stuck in the mud, as he remembered, or the silt, Dion suddenly floated free. And with him came a cloud of silt, sort of blinding Dave Shaw a little bit. And then Dave Shaw found himself on the bottom at that depth, trying to control a rolling, turning, slightly buoyant mass and get it into a body bag. And he lost focus. I mean, it's the classic thing. I mean, obviously he was accumulating narcosis, and he became so fixated on trying to get the body into the bag that he lost track of, or lost his sense of danger, I think. I mean, the interesting thing is he keeps keeping track of the time he's on the bottom. But at the same time, he's so fixated on doing the work, he's not recognizing the fact that his breathing is starting to increase. It's getting too rapid. Dion...
Mr. Shirley was sitting there watching this, your article said, saying, just come up, just bring him up, just come up.
Well, when Don Shirley was watching the tape, he couldn't keep himself from exclaiming, leave the body, leave the... As soon as he saw the body was not behaving as they expected, he was saying exactly out loud, just leave, just leave. And the irony is that because Dion was attached to the cave line, eventually they could have just pulled him up, so they didn't need to go through the body bag at all. In any case, Dave Shaw, he had the wherewithal to realize that, his bottom time was up. And so he tried to leave the body, but the body had been floating around and moving, and as anyone of your audience or listeners who cave dives knows, the one thing that's probably most dangerous in a cave is line. And so the cave line, or the cave reel that had led to Dion Dreyer, was all floating in the water. A number of times Dave got caught on it and had to stop and untangle himself. And when he left or tried to leave to go back to the shot line, the cave line was tangled on his equipment, but it was tangled behind him. And he suddenly slows, and you see this in the video, because all of a sudden he's starting to drag the body of Dion Dreyer, which turned out not to have been just a light bone. There's a substantial amount of flesh still in the wetsuit, so there was quite a heavy mass. And as he tried to move with Dion Dreyer dragging behind him, obviously his breathing then increased even further, and that's what led to his blackout and eventually his death.
But he brought him back.
He brought him back, and they, and that. I mean, I should mention. I mean, that made a big difference to Dion Dreyer's parents. I mean, one of the second most moving part of reporting this story was sitting and listening to Dion Dreyer's mother explain, which isn't something that's easy to understand, why it was so important for her to see the body of her son again, and what a difference it made in her life to be able to, literally touch him again. So Dave Shaw, really did something quite heroic as far as the Dreyer family is concerned. And he died on his own terms. I mean, everyone in Dave Shaw's family and Don Shirley, they're at some sort of peace. I mean, there's great sadness that he's gone. But they understood that Dave knew the risks and that Dave was doing something he loved doing. And so they're at peace with the fact that it happened as much as they miss Dave.
Very, very well told. Very well told. Looking back on this, so your story came out somewhere around summer of 2005. What can we take away from this? What can we learn from this?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. People, when you write about these kind of stories, there's two things they want to know. I mean, obviously they want to know what happened, what went wrong, but they also want to know why would a person do the kind of diving that Dave Shaw did. So it's a constant challenge as a writer to try to explain to people that there are people who just don't feel alive if they're not taking some risks. And the interesting thing about them is that they're not adrenaline junkies, I don't think. They're not people who just take random risks and get off on that. What they are people who love to take risks and to beat the risks by using reason and planning to try to minimize them. So that's the kind of person Dave Shaw was, and so that's something I take away, and something people find that they want to know about. Just why does anyone do that? And the second thing is, what can you learn in terms of a lesson? And I think it's difficult in this case because it's easy to say, well, Dave Shaw should have just left the body. But Dave Shaw was one of the most careful divers I've ever come across. He would never risk his life beyond a certain point knowingly. And so there was a level of narcosis that just overwhelmed him. So I think that the one thing that I do take away that's a potential lesson is that Dave Shaw didn't build up his level of narcosis tolerance very much. I talked to other divers. There's a South African diver named Nuno Gomez who's a world record diver. And Nuno has incredible respect for Dave. But he did say to me that he thought that to go back 2 or 3 months after doing the initial dive, in which Dave Shaw actually did suffer some slight problems with a minor bend, and then plunge right back into the dive, he thought, was a little bit of a mistake. And he likened it to, narcosis being like drinking martinis. And there are people who build up a tolerance and can operate more efficiently with all those martinis in them. And there are people who get drunk and can't function as well. And I think Dave Shaw wasn't prepared for the level of narcosis, and once it hit him, if the job wasn't going smoothly and right, then he was going to be in trouble. And I think that's what happened.
Well put, well put. Now, where can our listeners go? Where's the website where they can read the story for themselves?
Well, they can go to outsideonline.com, or they can just Google Tim Zimmerman and Dave Shaw, and the story will come up. It's appeared on Nightline And ABC did another program about it, although I've never seen that one.
I saw the 2020 show.
The 2020 show, which was interesting. And I think they used completely different footage than the 20 hours or more that the guy I was with shot. And, of course, Hollywood producers then started calling up, and Dave Shaw's wife, Ann, and everyone else, and started promising the world. And they're hoping eventually to have some sort of movie made out of it, and to use the money they get to buy a decompression chamber that would be their own mobile decompression chamber. But so far as I know, nothing has come of all the potential movie pitches that have been done.
Let's hope that comes about.
No, that would be a good cause for sure.
Well, Tim, do you have any parting words for our listeners?
Just dive safely.
Dive safely.
Go deep, but dive safe. I think it's very interesting to go into these caves. I think it's very interesting to dive where most people don't dive, but just be careful and be safe.
I'm going to leave our listeners with a quoting from your article. This is quoting Lisa Shaw in the eulogy for her father. She wrote, "I know, having faced death before, that my father was unafraid and was completely at peace with the prospect. I know, and he knew, that the Lord would be right there ready to take him on to new adventures. I am also at peace because he died doing something he loved. Very few of us will ever get that privilege." And that's well put by her, too. A fine testimony to her father there.
You're giving me shivers again.
Well, I'm sure this is going to give some shivers to our listeners, too. So, Tim, thank you very much. Hopefully we can keep in touch, and maybe we'll have another interview sometime if you're doing anything else with diving and it touches on videography, too.
Absolutely. I enjoyed it.
All right. Thank you very much.
Explore the depths with the Underwater Videographer Podcast.